If you asked me why a man who had spent over 2 decades in some of the toughest special operations missions chose to hide away in a remote valley, my answer would be simple. Peace can't be bought, and I've already paid enough to know its value. For 27 years, Stone Creek Valley in western Wyoming has been the only place I've called home. No billboards, no honking horns, just early morning winds slipping through the pines and the sound of roosters announcing the dawn. So that morning, when a pristine white Porsche Cayenne rolled up to my wooden gate, splattering mud on its sides, I knew my peace was about to end. I'm Ethan Caldwell, a former Navy Special Operations officer who walked away from the service at 40 with a few scars you can see and plenty you can't. When my teammates scattered to different lives, I chose Stone Creek, a valley tucked deep between windswept mountains. I bought 60 acres of land no one cared about, then spent 4 years building everything from the ground up with my own 2 hands. A 3-bedroom log cabin sits at the edge of the forest, its green metal roof faded by the weather, with a wide porch perfect for sipping coffee while the sun climbs over Granite Ridge. The cattle barn is cedar built, solid enough to shrug off last winter's blizzard with only a few boards loosened. Next to it stands a tin-roofed chicken coop, home to 26 laying hens I've raised since I left the Navy. At the far end of the pasture lies a broad pond, good for trout fishing and irrigation for my organic vegetable garden. Every morning at 4:30, I roll out of bed, pull on a sweater, and step outside while the ground is still white with frost. First, I check on my 14 dairy cows, milk them, then scatter feed for the chickens. After that, I head to the garden to inspect rows of kale, carrots, and pumpkins. It's a simple routine, but for me, it's the ritual that keeps me steady after years of chaos. Finally, I settle into the wooden chair on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the first gold light spill over the pasture. Pure peace. Until Veronica Blake arrived. I remember that day, clearly the earth still damp from an overnight rain, mud thick along the driveway. The Porsche door opened, and out stepped a woman. She wore a deep crimson evening dress, a pair of $100 high heels, sinking into the mud like knives into butter. Her hair was perfectly curled, her perfume drowning out the scent of soil and grass. She stumbled a few steps, then tilted her chin at me as if I were some hired help at a cocktail party. I'm Veronica Blake, president of Silver Horizon Estates. Mr. Caldwell, this ranch is a stain on the whole community. I set my coffee cup down, wondering how far she'd driven just to say that, and asked, "How long have you been here?" 27 days, she replied without hesitation. I've been here 27 years, I said, and felt the heavy silence drop between us. Veronica started listing her requirements: tear down the log cabin because it fails aesthetic standards, get rid of the cattle because the smell is offensive, remove the chickens due to noise complaints, hire a landscaping company to redo the vegetable garden, and drain the fishing pond because it poses a public health risk. She spoke as if everything I'd built was nothing more than an eyesore to be erased for her vision. I listened to every word, then answered, "This land isn't part of your HOA. I'm under no obligation to change a thing, and I won't." Her eyes darkened instantly. I knew that look. I'd seen it on people who couldn't stand being told no. As she left, her expensive shoes were caked in mud, but I knew the stain she intended to leave would be far worse. I didn't yet know the full scale of the storm coming my way, but the instincts that once kept me alive under enemy fire in Afghanistan were crystal clear. This wasn't a petty dispute. It was the opening move in a war I had to win, not just to keep my land, but to protect the peace I'd spent a lifetime searching for. Veronica didn't waste a single day after that first meeting. If she couldn't charm me into compliance, she was going to grind me down until I gave up. And she came at me in layers: paperwork first, then pressure, then whatever she could dream up next. Week 1 was all about the official warning. A neatly typed letter arrived in my mailbox, printed on Silver Horizon Estates letterhead. It listed community violations like a grocery list, non-compliant architecture, unapproved livestock, unmaintained landscaping, unsafe water features. Attached were grainy zoom lens photos of my cabin, my cows, even my garden, taken from just inside her property line. At the bottom, in bold, "You have 30 days to correct these violations, or face penalties." Week 2 turned up the heat. Another letter, this one with a bright red final notice, stamped across the top, claimed I was being fined $800 per day for each violation. By her math, I was suddenly racking up nearly $4,000 a day in penalties from an HOA I didn't even belong to. I might have laughed if I didn't know the tactic overwhelmed the target with numbers so big they start panicking. Week 3 brought the first legal threat. A courier handed me a notice of pending litigation at 6:15 a.m. while I was hauling hay. Inside was a 5-page complaint claiming I was willfully and maliciously lowering property values for Silver Horizon Estates homeowners. There weren't even homeowners yet. Her subdivision was still under construction, but that didn't stop her from treating it like a gated kingdom. Week 4 was the ultimatum. Sell within 10 days or face consequences. No specifics, just a vague, cold promise written in the kind of language meant to rattle a man's nerves. But the paperwork was just her opening act. The real fun started when she moved into physical harassment. One Monday morning, I found a yellow excavator parked sideways across my gravel driveway, blocking both entry and exit. The construction foreman swore it was an accident during grading work for the estate's access road, but somehow the machine stayed there for 30 hours before a tow truck finally moved it. 3 days later, my mailbox lay in pieces. At the base of the post, looked like it had met the front end of a truck. 2 weeks after that, same thing again. The county postmaster told me I was lucky they didn't suspend my delivery entirely for repeated mailbox destruction. Then there were the anonymous complaints. I got a knock at the door from a county health inspector claiming they'd received a tip that my pond was a mosquito breeding ground posing imminent public health hazards. I had trout swimming in that pond and a water circulation system I'd built myself, no stagnant water anywhere. Still, they took samples and left me with a thinly veiled warning about possible remediation orders. At night, I started seeing movement along the fence line. Once, I caught the glint of binoculars in the moonlight. Twice, I found fresh boot prints in the mud on the backside of my property far from any public road. Whoever it was had been watching me from the dark. I've been in enough hostile environments to know when pressure is being applied deliberately. This wasn't random mischief. This was a strategy. Keep me off balance, wear me down, make living here such a constant battle that selling starts to sound like a relief. What Veronica didn't know was that I'd seen this exact pattern before, just not in real estate. In the military, we called it softening the target. In her world, it was harassment wrapped in legal paper. In mine, it was the prelude to a strike. So I did what I'd always done before a fight. I gathered intel. I started digging into Veronica Blake's past, not the glossy magazine interviews about her luxury lifestyle developments, but the things people didn't brag about. It didn't take long to find the rot. In 3 different states, she had rolled into small rural communities with her Silver Horizon brand. She'd buy land, build high-end homes, and wage quiet wars against anyone who didn't fit her image: farmers, mechanics, people whose properties didn't look good in her brochures. She'd weaponize HOA rules, manipulate local officials, and drown her targets in fines, lawsuits, and smear campaigns until they sold out for pennies on the dollar. 5 families, 5 separate properties gone in less than a decade. And in every case, she flipped their land into expansion for her developments. It wasn't a side effect. It was the business model. Realizing I wasn't just up against an entitled neighbor, but a professional land predator changed everything. This wasn't going to burn out on its own. If she couldn't push me off my land through intimidation, she'd escalate. And if she escalated, she'd come harder than before. I knew then I had 2 choices: hope she ran out of steam, or prepare for the kind of fight I'd sworn I'd left behind when I hung up my uniform. I chose the second. The trail cameras went up first every 100 yards along the fence line. Then came motion sensors at the gates, floodlights wired to trip switches, and reinforcement on every door and window of the cabin. I tuned up the old diesel generator, stocked supplies, and made sure every inch of my land could be monitored without stepping outside. I'd built this ranch to be my refuge. Now, it was becoming my fortress. And in the back of my mind, I could feel it, the quiet before the storm. When you've spent years reading the terrain for hidden threats, you develop a 6th sense for patterns, little inconsistencies that don't add up until you put them together. By the time Veronica's harassment campaign had reached its 4th week, I'd already decided that if she was going to play this like a covert operation, then I'd run my own counterintelligence. The first crack in her facade came from a man named Carter Hayes, a cement truck driver I'd known for years. One afternoon, I caught him in town and asked if he'd been doing any work for Silver Horizon Estates. He hesitated, glanced over his shoulder, and said quietly, "Off the record, Ethan, she's not just building houses. She's building a takeover." Then he told me something that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. Veronica had been buying up small parcels of land on the edges of her development, one by one, but not at market price. Owners were encouraged to sell after a string of suspicious code violations, surprise inspections, and, in 2 cases, fires ruled accidental. I started pulling property records. In the last 12 years, Silver Horizon, or one of its shell companies, had absorbed dozens of rural properties across 3 states. Every acquisition followed the same script. First came the HOA letters, then legal threats, then a wave of bad luck for the property owner until they caved. 5 families in Montana, 3 in Colorado, and 4 in Nebraska had all been driven out using the same playbook. Once they were gone, their land was annexed into the development and flipped for millions. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. I found a news clipping from a small-town paper in Nebraska. Local farmer's barn burns in suspected arson. The farmer, a man named Owen Briggs, had lost his livestock, his equipment, and his home in one night. The fire marshal called it an accident. 6 months later, the Briggs property was sold to a holding company registered to one of Veronica's business partners. Owen Briggs moved to a rental apartment in Omaha and died 2 years later from a heart attack. I tracked down another name, Marcy and Ben Fletcher in Montana. They'd fought the HOA in court for 18 months before losing everything. The judge in their case? A personal friend of Veronica's main investor. Their farmhouse now sits inside the gated section of Silver Horizon's Montana property, repainted and marketed as Heritage Lot Number 1. By the time I was done, I had a wall in my office covered in maps, photographs, and timelines. Red lines connected properties, shell companies, and contractors. Blue pins marked victims. Black pins marked accidents. And in the center of it all, Veronica Blake, smiling in a dozen glossy real estate ads. I wasn't just another grumpy neighbor to her. I was the latest name on a list. She'd already written my ending in her mind. And if history was any guide, she'd do whatever it took to make that ending real. Knowing her pattern gave me an advantage foreknowledge. And foreknowledge meant I could start building defenses tailored to the way she operated. I'd seen her escalate from letters to sabotage. The next step would be direct action, sending people to damage my property or intimidate me face to face. She'd use that tactic in Nebraska and Montana, hiring local contractors with shady pasts to do the dirty work. So I went hunting not for her, but for the people she might hire. I started with the bars and backrooms where you hear the kind of offers that never make it into a newspaper. At Rusty's Tap Room, a biker named Lenny Crow Mathers let slip that some new money was asking about demolition jobs with no paper trail. At a pool hall in the next county, I overheard 2 construction workers laughing about easy cash from that lady in the red dress. The more I listened, the clearer it became. She was already assembling a crew. I began shifting my preparations into high gear. The cattle guard trick at my driveway steel bars disguised under plywood was ready. Portable cattle panels were rearranged into what looked like normal pasture fencing but actually formed a maze. I rerouted irrigation to flood low spots overnight, turning them into mud traps by morning. The electric fence got an upgrade still within safety limits, but enough to make someone think twice about grabbing it. Meanwhile, my trail cameras hidden in fence posts and birdhouses started paying dividends. One night, I caught 3 men on foot along my north fence line, measuring distances with a laser rangefinder. Another night, someone left fresh tire tracks at the east gate, a gate I hadn't opened in 6 months. Whoever they were mapping my land, looking for entry points. It wasn't paranoia, it was the prelude. I'd seen it in Afghanistan before, raids probing the perimeter, finding weak spots, timing responses. The night before the first real strike, I sat on my porch under the weight of a Wyoming sky full of stars, feeling the stillness before a storm. Out there in the dark, somewhere past the tree line, I knew Veronica's pawns were getting their final instructions. And in my gut, I felt the truth I hadn't wanted to say out loud. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about breaking me. What Veronica didn't understand, and what she was about to learn the hard way, was that I'd been broken before, overseas, in places where the enemy wasn't half as polite as an HOA president. I knew how to rebuild. I knew how to fight back. And most importantly, I knew how to turn a battlefield to my advantage. The difference this time, the battlefield was my home. And I wasn't planning on losing it. It happened just before dawn on a Thursday, a time I'd learned to pay attention to in the service. Dawn is when people let their guard down, when shadows start to fade but the day hasn't fully arrived. It's also when the air carries sound for miles. That morning, it carried the low growl of engines. From the loft window in my barn, I spotted them before they even hit the front gate. Two mud-splattered pickup trucks and an aging panel van with no plates. They rolled in like they owned the place, headlights off, engines rumbling low. Even from that distance, I could see the kind of body language you don't mistake guys who thought they were about to have an easy morning wrecking someone's property. I'd already learned their names from the whispers in county bars. Iron Jack built like a concrete wall, with a shaved head and a tattoo of brass knuckles across his neck. His partner, Stubbs, was smaller but meaner, the type who'd smile while kicking in a door. Tank, a 6'4" slab of muscle whose patience for subtlety was non-existent. Mole, an ex-handyman who could pop a lock in seconds. The other three I didn't recognize, but they had the same swagger men who'd been paid to make problems disappear. What they didn't know was that they were walking into a live-fire training exercise minus the bullets designed by someone who'd been planning it for weeks. The first surprise hit them the moment they turned down my driveway. Beneath the gravel was my little invention. Two cattle guards, those heavy metal grates, meant to keep livestock from crossing, installed into the roadbed and disguised with thin plywood and loose dirt. Their trucks rolled over, and the front ends dropped with a metallic clang. The plywood shattered, the undercarriages bottomed out, and all three vehicles ended up high-centered rear tires spinning uselessly. I watched from the shadows as curses filled the air. They climbed out, surveying the damage, and you could see the first flicker of doubt cross their faces. But quitting wasn't on the menu. They started on foot. 50 acres is a lot of ground to cover when you don't know it, and I'd made sure every approach was educational. The first obstacle was the maze portable cattle panels, rearranged into dead ends, loops, and tight turns. It looked like open pasture until you were in it, and then you'd realize you were going in circles. Tank tried to shortcut by vaulting over a fence post right into the hot wire of my upgraded electric fence. He let out a howl, dropped his crowbar, and staggered back, shaking his hands like he'd just grabbed a lightning bolt. Iron Jack fared no better. He marched into what looked like a solid patch of dirt between two panels and sank up to his waist in mud. Not just any mud irrigation runoff I'd let pool overnight, thick and clinging like quicksand. It took both Stubbs and another guy to haul him out, and by the time they did, all three were covered head to toe in muck. Meanwhile, Mole had slipped away toward the barn, clearly thinking he'd find something to wreck. What he found instead was my feed bin surprise, a release catch I'd rigged, so that anyone opening the door would get 40 pounds of chicken feed dumped straight on them. Mole disappeared in a cloud of grain, and within seconds, 26 hens swarmed him like he was the guest of honor at a poultry riot. The rest of the crew stumbled into my sprinkler system, which I'd modified to activate on motion sensors. In the pre-dawn chill, icy well water blasted them from all sides, turning the churned dirt under their boots into a skating rink. One of the unknown's big guy in a camo jacket slipped so hard, he nearly took down two of his buddies on the way down. By now, their mission had gone from intimidate the rancher to get the hell out of here, but retreat wasn't easy. They were wet, muddy, disoriented, and their vehicles were still stuck in my driveway. That's when I decided to make my entrance. I stepped out onto the porch, bathrobe tied, steaming mug of coffee in hand, like I just wandered out to watch the sunrise. "Morning, fellas," I called. "Looks like you're having a bit of trouble out there. Want me to rustle up some breakfast before you head out?" They froze, turning toward the sound of my voice. 6 grown men, dripping water, caked in mud, and sporting chicken feathers in their hair. It was the kind of scene you could frame and hang in a gallery. And right on cue, headlights appeared at the road, Sheriff Harris in his cruiser. 2 deputies behind him. The sheriff stepped out, took one look at the 3 stranded vehicles and the 7 miserable would-be enforcers, and just shook his head. Within minutes, zip ties were on wrists, rights were being read, and the back seats of the cruisers were full. Charges: criminal trespass, attempted vandalism, possession of burglary tools. As the deputies drove them away, Veronica's name never came up. It didn't need to. She wasn't stupid enough to leave her fingerprints on this mess. At least not yet. But she just learned something she wasn't expecting. I wasn't going to be run off with scare tactics. What I didn't know at that moment was that she'd also learned something else, something that would make her far more dangerous the next time she came at me. She realized she'd need professionals. A week passed after the first attack, and the ranch settled back into its familiar rhythm on the surface. The cows still needed milking, the hens still lined up for feed, and the sun still spilled gold across the pasture every morning. But beneath that, I knew something had shifted. Veronica Blake had taken her first real swing at me and missed. People like her didn't take losses lightly. She wasn't going to lick her wounds and move on. She was going to escalate. It started with a whisper from a contact in town, a retired freight dispatcher named Hal, who'd been in the trucking business for 40 years. Over coffee at the diner, he leaned in and said, "You've got new faces in Stone Creek, not the kind that come for the fishing." I didn't need more than that. I began watching for them, and sure enough, I started spotting the tells. A silver SUV parked in the same spot near the feed store 3 days in a row. A lone man walking the county road at 10 p.m., pretending to be on his phone. A drone buzzing too high to be a kid's toy, hovering just long enough to map the property lines. These weren't Veronica's barroom thugs anymore. This was reconnaissance. It didn't take long to put names to the shadows. Marshall the leader, former Army Ranger with a face like weathered stone, and the kind of stillness that only comes from years of moving through dangerous places. Brick, a demolition man with a legitimate construction license that gave him cover for carrying enough explosives to level a small house. Blaze, an arson specialist who moonlighted as a fire inspector. And Shade the ghost, surveillance and infiltration expert, good enough to slip past most security systems unnoticed. The plan became clear as I pieced together their movements. This wasn't intimidation. They weren't coming to rattle me. They were coming to end the fight in one night. Burn the cabin and barn to the ground. Poison the cattle to make it look like a disease outbreak and leave me with nothing but ashes and bills. In Veronica's mind, it would be the final push. She'd underestimated me again. The first thing I did was double my defenses. I installed a fire suppression system in every building, wired to trigger manually or remotely. I added silent alarms linked directly to Sheriff Harris's office. I converted my storm cellar into a reinforced safe room with radios, backup power, and a separate camera feed that even Shade wouldn't find. I set extra trail cameras high, low, and hidden in ways only someone who'd set ambushes before would think of. 3 nights later, they came. It was a textbook approach, quiet, coordinated, efficient. Shade went in first, cutting what he thought were my primary cameras and sensors. Brick crept toward the barn, placing small-shaped charges along the foundation. Blaze moved in on the cabin, unrolling hoses from a black duffel, soaking the porch and walls in accelerant. Marshall stayed back on a small rise with a radio, calling the play like a man who'd done it 100 times. I waited until all 4 were in position. Then I hit the switch. The ranch came alive in an instant. Every floodlight snapped on, turning the night into day. The fire suppression system roared, blasting both the cabin and barn with high-pressure water, washing away the accelerant and soaking Brick's carefully placed charges until they fizzled uselessly. My hidden cameras, ones they didn't know existed, captured every face in crystal clarity. I'd even mounted one on the windmill to catch the overhead view, just for the record. They froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the silent alarm to bring Harris and 2 deputies roaring up the driveway, lights flashing but sirens off. Brick dropped his detonator like it had bitten him. Blaze stood there dripping, looking less like a firebug and more like a man who'd lost a bet with a sprinkler system. Shade, realizing the game was up, tried to vanish into the dark, but my perimeter motion sensors tracked his every move until Harris cut him off. Marshall didn't move at all, not until Harris was standing 5 feet away, sidearm drawn. Then he simply set his radio on the ground and raised his hands. It was over in minutes. The charges against them read like a federal case file: interstate conspiracy, possession of explosives, attempted arson, animal endangerment. And because they'd crossed state lines with intent to commit felonies, the FBI got involved before dawn. That was the part Veronica hadn't counted on. These weren't nameless locals. They were professionals with records the feds could leverage. Facing decades in federal prison, the first one flipped within 48 hours. Brick spilled everything: how they'd been hired, how much they'd been paid, and who had given them the blueprints for my ranch. Blaze and Shade followed, handing over phone records, text messages, and bank transfers. By the end of the week, the FBI had enough evidence to put Veronica on the hook for interstate criminal conspiracy. She must have thought she could still talk her way out of it. But when I saw her 2 days later standing in her driveway, phone to her ear, face pale and tight, I knew she'd realized she'd crossed a line she couldn't step back from. The professionals had failed. The law was now sniffing around her empire. And for someone like her, that meant only one thing: desperation. And desperation makes people dangerous. If Veronica couldn't destroy me with hired muscle, she'd try something more insidious, turning the system itself into a weapon. The first sign came in the form of a White County pickup pulling into my driveway one crisp autumn morning. The man who stepped out introduced himself as Brad Keller, county building inspector. He wore a neon vest and mirrored sunglasses, but his handshake told me everything I needed to know, too soft for a man who supposedly worked outdoors. Brad claimed he'd received concerns about the structural integrity of my cabin. That was interesting, considering I'd built the place to military specifications, reinforced beams, hurricane straps, the works. Still, I walked him through the property. He poked at my walls with a screwdriver, measured the porch posts, and scribbled in his notepad with a theatrical frown. When he finally spoke, his voice dripped with the smug authority of a man who thought he had me pinned. This place is 20 years behind code. You'll need to bring it up to modern standards or face fines $15,000 to start. I didn't bother hiding my grin. You realize I'm grandfathered in under the original permits? He paused, recalibrating, then said, "We'll see what my report says." 2 days later, Health Inspector Holly Peters showed up. She wore a lab coat because apparently that made her more official, and carried a clipboard like a weapon. Holly claimed she'd received anonymous reports that my cattle were diseased and posed a public health hazard. She insisted on testing my herd. I had nothing to hide, so I let her work while my hidden cameras rolled. Sure enough, halfway through her inspection, she pulled a small vial from her pocket and tried to smear its contents on one of my water troughs. "Careful," I said from behind her. "Wouldn't want you contaminating clean water." She froze, vial in hand. Then came Code Enforcement Officer Carl Denton with a brand new Corvette parked half a mile down the road. Carl was all swagger and threats, demanding I tear down my chicken coop because it was unpermitted, despite being on the original site plan approved decades ago. When I mentioned that Corvette to him specifically, how odd it was for a county employee to afford one on his salary, he stammered something about family money and left in a hurry. Finally, Environmental Inspector Ed Morales arrived with claims that my fishing pond violated new wetland regulations. He talked about draining it to restore the natural ecosystem. I reminded him the pond was man-made, built on private land, and stocked under a state-issued permit. Ed's confident smile faltered when I offered to call the State Wildlife Office together, right there on the spot. The pattern was obvious. 4 officials, 4 bogus inspections, all within 2 weeks. The timing wasn't a coincidence. I started digging into their finances. Public records and a few quiet conversations painted an ugly picture. Brad had just bought an $85,000 truck. Holly had a brand new in-ground swimming pool. Carl's Corvette was fresh off the lot. Ed had closed on a vacation condo in Florida. None of their salaries could touch those price tags. The smoking gun came when I planted my own surveillance. I parked an old pickup with a hidden camera outside Veronica's McMansion. Over 3 weeks, I recorded each of their vehicles pulling into her driveway for coordination meetings. On one recording from a diner across town, Brad's voice was crystal clear. "Don't worry, Veronica. We'll bury him in violations until he chokes." With the evidence locked down, I was ready for the courtroom. Her lawyer, Rick Slickman, came at me hard, filing nuisance suits, alleging property line encroachments, even claiming my viral video defamed her hired thugs. I decided to represent myself. One by one, I dismantled their cases. To Brad, I produced the original building permits, signed and sealed, along with the video of him meeting Veronica. To Holly, I presented the veterinary health certificates for my cattle, plus the footage of her attempting to plant contaminated material. Carl's case collapsed when I played a recording of him admitting the coop was grandfathered in. Ed folded instantly when I threatened to send his bogus environmental claims to federal investigators. The judge didn't just dismiss their cases, he sanctioned Slickman for filing frivolous lawsuits and ordered him to pay my legal costs. But I wasn't done. I filed a federal civil rights lawsuit under RICO statutes, alleging conspiracy to deprive me of my property through fraud and abuse of authority. Local corruption might thrive in county court, but federal court is another animal entirely. The four inspectors couldn't buy their way out of that one. Under pressure from federal investigators, Brad was the first to crack. He confessed to taking $50,000 from Veronica to find violations, handed over text messages, and gave up the others. Holly folded next, then Carl, then Ed, each one trading testimony for lighter sentences. Slickman's career ended with a disbarment notice and an indictment for conspiracy. And Veronica? She didn't show her face in public for weeks, but I knew she was still out there, seething, realizing that her local power base had just been gutted. And when someone like her loses the protection she's paid for, she tends to turn meaner. I'd won this round. But in war, winning a battle doesn't end the fight, it just changes the rules. By the time the dust settled from the legal battles, my name had already been circulating in places I never expected. Local farmers stopped me at the feed store to shake my hand. Strangers mailed letters of support, some with cash stuffed inside, but the real turning point came from an unexpected phone call. Her name was Rachel Monroe, a documentary producer known for exposing corporate land grabs and eminent domain abuses. She'd seen clips of my viral bathrobe standoff video and read about the courtroom victory against Veronica's bought and paid for inspectors. "Ethan," she said over the phone, "what's happening to you is bigger than your ranch. This is happening all over rural America. Let me tell your story on camera." Normally, I'd have turned her down. I value privacy more than most folks value oxygen. But by then, I'd realized Veronica's greatest asset wasn't her money, it was her ability to operate in the shadows, controlling the narrative. If sunlight is the best disinfectant, then maybe it was time to rip open the blinds. Rachel and her crew arrived 2 weeks later. They weren't the kind of television people you see in big city newsrooms, no shiny suits, no artificial smiles. They wore jeans, boots, and windbreakers, and they worked like ranch hands with cameras. They followed me through the full morning routine, milking cows, scattering chicken feed, checking fences. The footage was quiet, steady, and real. Then they'd cut to the other side of the story. OA letters taped to my door, photos of smashed mailboxes, legal documents stacked like firewood. Rachel's interviews went beyond me. She spoke with neighbors who'd lived in Stone Creek for generations. Old-timers recalled when Veronica first showed up with her Porsche and glossy brochures, promising elevated living in the middle of working ranch country. Younger farmers talked about the intimidation tactics they'd seen or heard about surveyors trespassing, anonymous complaints to county offices, and the sudden appearance of strangers lurking near their property lines. The contrast was stark, honest, hard-working people just trying to live, versus a developer with endless resources to bend the system her way. Word spread quickly. Local news picked up the story first, running a segment titled, "Rancher Pushes Back Against HOA Harassment." Then regional papers got hold of it. Soon, national outlets were calling. By the time Rachel's teaser trailer hit social media, my phone was buzzing constantly, interview requests, offers of help, even invitations to speak at property rights conferences. But the attention brought something else. Momentum. One Saturday morning, I stepped outside to find more than 20 trucks and SUVs parked along my driveway. Farmers, ranchers, and even some folks from town stood waiting. Many I'd never met before. "We're here to help," one man said simply. They'd brought lumber, fencing supplies, tools, anything I might need to reinforce the ranch. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about sending a message. Veterans from across the county joined in too. They understood the principle at stake. They organized watch rotations, quietly patrolling the perimeter at night. Some brought radios and night vision gear from their own collections. I didn't ask where it all came from. I didn't need to. Rachel captured it all on film. The camaraderie, the shared meals in my kitchen, the way people worked side by side without being asked. Her camera caught details I'd taken for granted, the worn grooves on my porch from 27 years of boots, the way my cattle followed me across the pasture, the wind ruffling the American flag over the barn. And then came the day Veronica tried her next move. This time, she didn't send local thugs or flashy inspectors. She hired a corporate security team, 8 men in matching tactical gear, arriving in two black SUVs with tinted windows. They had earpieces, high-end drones, and the kind of swagger you see from people who believe a paycheck makes them bulletproof. Their goal was obvious: overwhelm through presence. They spread out across the county road in front of my gate, filming the property, talking into radios, making it clear they could come closer anytime they wanted. Only this time, they weren't the only ones with an audience. 50 people, neighbors, veterans, and reporters were already on my side of the fence. Sheriff Harris was there too, leaning on his cruiser, reminding the security team that private property was exactly that. Rachel's crew filmed every second, from the moment the SUVs pulled up to the awkward shuffle when they realized they were outnumbered 3-1. One of the corporate guys tried to step onto my driveway. A half-dozen ranchers closed ranks without saying a word. Another team member glanced up at the buzzing drone overhead only to see a second drone, flown by a volunteer, circling to capture their every move from above. For 30 minutes, they postured, muttered into radios, and pretended they had a plan. Then, with cameras rolling and law enforcement watching, they did something I hadn't expected. They retreated. The image of those black SUVs pulling away while a crowd of farmers and veterans waved them off hit the evening news that night. By morning, it was viral. The headline read, "Corporate Security Retreats from Stone Creek Ranch Showdown." For Veronica, it was a disaster. Her intimidation had been publicly defanged. For us, it was a victory, but more than that, it was proof of something I'd always believed. When a community stands together, it's a force no developer's budget can match. Rachel's documentary wasn't even finished, but the footage from that day became its centerpiece, a living snapshot of ordinary Americans refusing to be bullied. And somewhere in her mansion, I knew Veronica was watching, realizing that her war on one man had just turned into a war with an entire community. When people like Veronica Blake start to lose everything, they don't just give up, they get dangerous. By the time Rachel's documentary footage had spread nationwide, her empire was collapsing in real time. Contracts for her luxury homes were being canceled. The bank called in her loans. The county was investigating her permits. The FBI was still circling over the conspiracy charges from the Chicago crew. She'd burned through money, favors, and allies. Now she was cornered, and cornered predators don't think rationally. I got the warning just after midnight from Sheriff Harris. His voice on the phone was low and sharp. "Ethan, we intercepted Chatter 10 man crew, heavily armed, heading your way before sunrise. This isn't intimidation. They're coming to kill you." The name at the center of it all was Bones Carver, a career criminal who just walked out of prison after serving 15 years for armed robbery and aggravated assault. Veronica had scraped together what was left of her fortune jewelry, heirlooms, even her wedding ring to pay him and his men $100,000 for what she called her final solution. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Break into the ranch in the dead of night, kill me during a staged burglary, take enough valuables to make it look legitimate, and then torch the place to erase evidence. When the fire was found in the morning, it would be ruled a tragic robbery gone wrong. Veronica could play the grieving neighbor and walk away with her problem solved. She hadn't counted on how fast news travels in a small town, especially when the whole county already had my back. Within hours of Harris's call, trucks started rolling up my driveway. Friends, neighbors, veterans, over 30 of them stepped out with rifles, shotguns, radios, and determined faces. The FBI and state police coordinated with Harris to lock down every road in and out of Stone Creek. Tactical officers in unmarked SUVs took up positions in the tree line. A helicopter equipped with searchlights and cameras orbited silently in the darkness. Rachel and her crew, already in town for follow-up interviews, set up their cameras in the safe zones. This wasn't just a defense, it was a stage. And if there was going to be a fight, the whole country was going to see it. We spent the hours before dawn turning the ranch into a fortress. Vehicles were repositioned as barricades. Fences were reinforced with heavy timbers. Floodlights were wired to switch on at my signal. The safe room in my storm cellar was prepped for non-combatants. Every approach to the house was covered by overlapping fields of fire, just like we'd done overseas. At 4:58 a.m., headlights appeared on the county road. 3 stolen vehicles rolled toward the ranch: an old box truck, a dark SUV, and a beat-up sedan. They cut their lights 100 yards out, creeping forward in silence. Through my binoculars, I could make out Bones at the wheel of the truck, a massive figure with a shaved head and a permanent sneer. They stopped at the gate, spilled out, and started moving fast spread formation, weapons up. These weren't drunk bar fighters. They were armed predators with nothing to lose. I let them get just close enough. Then I hit the switch. Every floodlight on the property blazed to life, flooding the pasture with white light. The helicopter's search beam locked onto the intruders. From the shadows, 30 armed citizens stepped forward, flanked by law enforcement officers in full tactical gear. Red laser dots danced across the chests of Bones's crew. For a moment, there was only stillness. Then Bones barked, "We just want Caldwell, let him come out, and we'll walk." I stepped onto the porch with a bullhorn in my hand. "Bones, you're surrounded by the FBI, state police, and enough armed neighbors to fill a parade. Drop your weapons and surrender. This is your only way out alive." He glanced around, calculating. He saw no gap, no weak flank. The realization hit him he'd walked into a kill box with no escape. One by one, the guns hit the dirt. 10 hardened criminals, each with a rap sheet longer than my arm, went face down in the gravel while agents moved in with zip ties. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. 2 black SUVs rolled up from the highway, and Veronica Blake stepped out. She wasn't in heels this time, just jeans and a jacket, but her eyes still carried that same venom from the day she first stood in my driveway. The FBI agents didn't waste time. They put her in cuffs on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to interstate racketeering. As they walked her past me, she turned her head and hissed, "This isn't over." But it was, because the cameras had caught everything. The standoff, the surrender, the arrest. By the time the sun rose over Stone Creek, the footage was already on every major news network. The world saw exactly what happens when a community stands its ground against money, power, and corruption. And Veronica Blake's war ended not with the victory she'd paid for, but with the image of her being driven away in the back of a federal SUV, her empire in ruins, her name forever tied to her own downfall. 5 years have passed since the night Veronica Blake's war against me ended in flashing lights, zip ties, and the cold steel of federal handcuffs. The air in Stone Creek feels lighter now, the kind of quiet that seeps into your bones and stays there. The cows still need milking, the hens still scratch at the dirt for grain, and the porch still creaks under my boots each morning as I sit down with that first cup of coffee. But everything else? Everything has changed. Veronica is serving what amounts to a life sentence in a federal penitentiary. I've heard through the grapevine that her once perfect smile has given way to deep lines etched by stress and regret. In prison, no one cares about property values or quarterly returns. Her elevated living speeches don't earn her anything but rolled eyes from cellmates. The designer wardrobe is long gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit with her name stitched in black. She works laundry detail for 23 cents an hour, and her daily audience is a bank of humming dryers instead of a boardroom. Most of her crew met similar ends. The Chicago professionals are serving decades, their careers in the shadows over for good. Bones Carver will be eligible for parole in 30 years. He'll be in his 70s by then, if he makes it that far. The 7-man crew from the first attack now live small, invisible lives, their reputations in tatters. I've seen 2 of them in passing, working odd jobs for cash under the table, eyes down when they recognize me. The inspectors who sold their integrity for envelopes of cash lost far more than their careers. Federal restitution orders stripped them of homes and savings. Brad's fancy truck was repossessed. Holly's swimming pool sits cracked and dry behind the house she no longer owns. Carl's Corvette was auctioned off by the bank, and Ed's Florida condo is now a vacation rental for tourists he'll never meet. Around here, their names are a warning, spoken by parents to their kids. Don't end up like them. As for me, I didn't just keep the ranch, I expanded it. When Veronica's development foreclosed, I bought the land through a veterans cooperative for a fraction of its luxury price. Those empty McMansions were converted into affordable housing for working families and veterans. The Grand Silver Horizon Clubhouse became a community center where we hold town meetings, weddings, and property rights workshops. The ranch itself has grown to 250 acres. We've added more cattle, expanded the vegetable operation, and built a teaching program for local schools. Kids come here to learn about sustainable farming, water conservation, and the importance of standing up when someone tries to take what's yours. Rachel's documentary, Stone Creek, Holding the Line, won awards I never bothered to keep track of. What mattered was the impact, It became a rallying cry for property owners across the country. State legislatures started passing reforms. 17 states now have stronger laws limiting HOA powers, increasing transparency, and protecting owners from targeted harassment. In legal circles, pulling a Caldwell became shorthand for documenting everything, fighting smart, and refusing to be bullied off your land. The victory brought attention, sure, but it also brought responsibility. I helped found the Rural Rights Defense Foundation, which provides legal and tactical support to families facing the same kind of pressure I did. We've helped over 500 property owners in the last 3 years. Sometimes that means finding a lawyer willing to fight pro bono. Sometimes it means setting up security cameras and helping a family sleep through the night without worrying who's out there. The truth is, I didn't win alone. My neighbors, friends, and complete strangers stood shoulder to shoulder with me when it mattered most. That's the real legacy of what happened here. Not that one stubborn man held his ground, but that an entire community decided enough was enough. There's a sign now at the entrance to the ranch. It reads, Caldwell Ranch, where bullies learn lessons. Visitors take photos under it, some laughing, some just nodding with a look I understand all too well. The lesson is simple. Power and money can be loud, but they can't drown out the sound of people united in what's right. They can't bulldoze the kind of resolve that comes from knowing the land under your feet is yours because you earned it, cared for it, and defended it. Veronica's war against me started over aesthetics. She thought my cabin, my cattle, and my garden weren't good enough for her vision. It ended with her learning that some things don't bend for money, no matter how much you throw at them. Every morning, I watch the sun rise over these pastures, the light spilling over land that will stay in my family for generations. And I remember something my father used to say, if you're not willing to fight for what you love, you're just renting it from fate. Stone Creek isn't just my home. It's a reminder that standing your ground isn't about stubbornness. It's about honoring the work, the history, and the community that built a life worth defending. And if anyone comes down that county road thinking they can take it from me, well, let's just say I still know how to make a welcome they'll never forget.